Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Got a really exciting debate here today. Did Jesus rise from the dead with Juan, Modern Atheist, and Phil Bair. Really excited to facilitate this. And Dale from Real Seekers is going to be actually moderating. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to him, and I'll be here in the background listening. So, Dale, passing it over to you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I know Phil and Juan were on your show once before debating the beginning of the universe and
Right.
cosmology there. So today we're kind of switching gears to look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. And basically, the goal is to prove Juan is wrong. But no. Uh, but yeah, Phil and Juan are going to have a great talk. They have a great rapport with each other. But yeah, just before we begin, Juan, I'll start with you. What have you kind of been up to on your end since you were last on the show?
Nothing much really, just the standard stuff, making videos. I had Richard Carrier on the channel. Oh, I'm gonna have him again on Christmas, close to Christmas. I already recorded the video, but I will show on Christmas a video about the nativity. So that's going to be very interesting, I think.
Awesome, awesome. And Phil, what have you been up to since the last time you were on the show?
Oh, I've been working on my book, actually, the book that I already published, and I've been adding chapters to it and then revising it. And I've added a chapter on annihilationism and a couple of other topics. I don't remember what they are now. My memory is kind of short right now these days. But no, that was the same thing. So yeah, and I've been working on some musical arrangements, and because my ministry is a three-part ministry, it's about music, it's about apologetics, and it's about prayer. So and I'm working on my prayer app a little bit as well. So just miscellaneous tinkering.
All right, awesome. So yeah, like I said, today this topic is: Did Jesus rise from the dead? And the format for today is so each of the guests are going to have 10-minute openings, followed by 10-minute rebuttals, and then 15 minutes cross examine section each, followed by 30 minutes or so of informal dialogue between the two people there, and then 5-minute closings. And then we will bring Michael in to ask any audience questions that people raise in the chat. So that's the plan for today. I guess what I'll do is when we have how much notice do you guys want? Like when we're about 2 minutes from the deadline, or like
One,
1 minute? Okay, so I'll just
but
come in and say 1 minute
that
left.
okay with you, Juan?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, so I'll just jump in and say 1 minute left, kind of thing. So okay. With that said, Phil, let's start with you making the positive case. You have your 10 minutes. In Let me know. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. In 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, first of all, I just want to express my delight that I'm being able to have this conversation with Juan. Juan's one of my favorite people, and I'm a big fan of Juan. So he's a great guy, and he's very thoughtful and very respectful, and I just really like interacting with him. So thanks for doing this, Juan. This is going to be fun. But I want to approach the resurrection of Jesus Christ from a simple but powerful standpoint, and it's the standpoint of what the apostles knew. And so I call this my series of epistemic arguments for the resurrection. So if the resurrection did not occur, the apostles knew it did not occur. They were not distant historians or religious zealots repeating someone else's story. They were eyewitnesses to the death of Jesus, his burial, and to everything that occurred in the days that followed. They were in the thick of it. They were the ones who fled in fear. They were the ones who locked themselves away in despair, and they watched the movement collapse in real time. So if the resurrection had not taken place, no one on earth would have known that fact with more certainty than they did. Yet these same men became absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. They proclaimed it publicly, consistently, and universally for the rest of their lives. They claimed they actually spent time with the risen Jesus, and they described that experience in abundant detail. If they didn't have those experiences, they would have known beyond the slightest doubt that they were not telling the truth when they described them. Now, it's impossible to be genuinely convinced of something that you know is false unless your mind has lost contact with reality, and that's called insanity, a complete collapse of rational coherence. But the apostles were not insane. Their writings are measured, coherent, reasoned, and morally structured, and they display clarity of thought, steadiness of conviction, and intellectual discipline. Their sanity and consistency are not in dispute. So here's the syllogism. 1, if the resurrection did not occur, the apostles knew it did not occur. 2, the apostles were absolutely convinced that it did occur. 3, it's impossible to be convinced of what you know is false unless you are insane. 4, the apostles were not insane. 5, therefore the resurrection occurred. So that's the epistemic coherence argument. It rules out both deceit and delusion, leaving only the truth of the resurrection itself. This argument establishes more than just the belief of the apostles. It establishes what they knew to be true and what they knew or they would have known to be false. So next we have the immediacy of falsifiability argument. If the resurrection did not occur, disproving it in the first century Jerusalem would have been the easiest thing in the world. The claim was public, it was specific and local. Romans had the body, the Jewish authorities had the motive. The city was filled with witnesses. A single presentation of the corpse would have destroyed Christianity on the spot. Yet that never happened. The one act that could have silenced the entire Christian message forever was never performed. Why? Because there was no body to present. So the argument goes like this. 1, if the resurrection did not occur, falsifying it in first century Jerusalem would have been trivial. 2, it was never falsified, even though it would have been an effortless task to do so. 3, therefore, the resurrection occurred. The Christian movement was not born in obscurity or centuries after the fact. It was born in the very place where the claim could have been conclusively falsified immediately if it wasn't true. The fact that it was not falsified itself is itself evidence that it was true. So finally, we have the argument from absolute confidence in public witness. If the resurrection did not occur, the apostles knew they could never get away with publicly claiming that it did. They were proclaiming this in the same city among the same people who had seen Jesus die. They knew that if the body was still in the tomb, or if not in the tomb, was nevertheless accessible, or if his death had been final, their claim would have been laughed out of existence. It would have been the suicide of credibility. And yet they made the claim boldly and publicly in the face of every possible contradiction, and they never retracted it. That kind of evidential confidence can only arise from firsthand knowledge. People do not stake their reputations and their lives on a claim they know their opponents can disprove. So the argument is, 1, if the resurrection did not occur, the apostles knew they could not publicly get away with saying it did. 2, they proclaimed it anyway, fearlessly and repeatedly. 3, therefore the resurrection occurred. So these 3 arguments, epistemic coherence, immediacy of falsifiability, and evidential confidence, form a unified case. Each one by itself is powerful, but together they establish that the resurrection is not merely the best explanation of the evidence, it is the only explanation consistent with reason, with history, and with the undeniable reality of what the apostles knew. Now, I want to address a modern objection that often gets repeated without any critical examination. Skeptics tell us that if the resurrection had occurred in our age of advanced technology, the evidence would be stronger because cameras and digital verification would replace the weakness of human testimony. That assumption fails for one simple reason. Technology never replaces testimony. It only reframes it. Every technological artifact depends entirely on human testimony to function as evidence. A camera cannot tell you who it recorded. A device cannot assure you that it captured the right event at the right time and under the right conditions. A forensic program cannot announce that its authentication procedures were executed correctly. Only a person can assert these things. And once you rely on a person, you rely on memory, competence, honesty, and judgment. In other words, recording technology is not independent evidence and does not exist in a vacuum. It requires more testimony, not less. A video of an event demands a camera operator who testifies to what he recorded, a custodian who testifies how the file was stored, an analyst who testifies that no tampering occurred, and a chain of experts who testify that the testing procedures were carried out accurately. Remove human testimony from any of these steps, and the technological evidence loses all force. So the skeptic gains nothing by appealing to modern technology. If he rejects human testimony as an epistemic category, he cannot use technology either, because every technological verification stands on the very thing he disqualifies. Testimony is not the weak link, it is the foundation. It grounded the evidence chain from the very first century, and it grounds the evidence chain even today. And because the resurrection is an event of personal encounter, testimony is not a limitation. It's the appropriate medium of knowledge for that kind of event. Finally, I want to clarify that why these arguments carry the weight they do. They are not external artifacts imposed on the New Testament. They emerge from the core nature of the apostolic witness. The apostles never presented the resurrection as an abstract philosophy or a symbolic narrative. They presented it as something they knew by direct experience. Their writings revolve around first-hand knowledge, what they saw, what they heard, what they touched, and what they personally encountered. This matters because it means that grounding the resurrection in testimony does not weaken the case, it aligns it with the original evidential form. The apostles appealed to their own knowledge because that was the correct epistemic vehicle for the event itself. The resurrection did not occur in the scope of repeatable laboratory conditions. It occurred within the habitat of personal encounter. And testimony remains the only epistemic category that functions across every age, whether ancient or modern. So skeptics who demand modern verification fail to see that the evidential form of the resurrection does not change simply because the calendar advances. Testimony carries force because it conveys what rational agents know. And in the case of the resurrection, it conveys what the apostles knew with certainty. They did not offer speculation or symbolic interpretation. They offered knowledge grounded in experience. So the trilogy of arguments I have presented, the epistemic coherence argument, the immediacy of falsifiability argument, and the argument from absolute confidence and public witness, fits precisely within the nature of the apostolic proclamation. The earliest Christians staked everything on what they knew to be true. And the evidential structure of their witness remains universally valid because it rests on the one epistemic principle that does not change from age to age: the testimony of rational, competent, fully sane observers who knew beyond question that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead.
All right, awesome. So now we will go to Juan to make the negative case. You have 10 minutes for your opening. Are you ready to go?
Yeah, just real quick, Michael, can you
Your slides.
present the slides, please? I can. Okay, great.
You're ready to go. All right, so 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, so why do I think Jesus didn't rise from the dead? So I'm going to be presenting 5 arguments. 1, the resurrection is prima facie improbable or unlikely. 2, the Gospels are anonymous. 3, the Gospels contain contradictions. 4, the Gospels contain unrealistic events. And 5, historians didn't mention the miracles of Jesus. So number 1, I think it's probably the most important one, is that the resurrection is prima facie unlikely, right? So the a priori probability that a narration that describes fantastic events is historical is a priori is at least very low, because this contradicts what we know about how the laws of nature work. And I think this is like intuitively obvious to most people. Like if you tell a friend, like, hey, I think a man resurrected from the dead and was able to make all these miracles. And your friend asks, like, okay, but why? And then if you tell him, oh no, because I found this ancient document that says so, right? I think your friend will like, okay, that's a bit crazy, right? I mean, like, people wouldn't believe that, right? Only because we are in the context of Christianity is that we believe, but normally nobody would believe that, right? David Hume makes this argument. He says, if someone tells me that he saw a dead man rising to life, I ask myself, which of these 2 options is more likely? 1, that this person was somehow mistaken or somehow lying, or 2, that the person actually rose from the dead. And the point is that a priori, the option 1 is much more likely, right? Which means the second option has a higher burden of evidence. Okay, so other than that, argument number 2, the Gospels are anonymous. So most modern critical Bible scholars agree that the Gospels are anonymous. And Bart Ehrman says that, okay, the first thing to emphasize about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that all four are completely anonymous. The authors never indicate who they are. They never name themselves. They never give any direct personal identification. And you know what is important here is that it's only in the late 2nd century that we get some clear attributions, right? And why is this important? Why is this relevant? Because all things given equal, the source for a historical document is a very important thing. And a claim that is in a source, which is a known, which has had a good reputation, like a good historian, has a higher weight than an event that is narrated in an anonymous document. Like we don't even know who wrote this. So here's a table with the attributions. If you look at the left side, you will see that most of them are in the late 2nd century. There's one caveat here, is Papias, which is in the early, around 100 or something. But that's one exception. We can talk about that. Okay. Argument number 3, the Gospels contain contradictions that make them unreliable. And I think there are many contradictions, but for time, we don't have time to go over all of them, obviously. So I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. One is the contradiction of how many angels were present at the tomb at the moment the women found it empty. We have Mark and Matthew saying that we had 1 angel. And on the other hand, we have Luke and John saying that there were 2 angels at the tomb. And this, for me, is like a very weird discrepancy if this came from an historical source. So is it like 1 angel or 2 angels? But if the authors were inventing details from a general oral tradition, then this makes sense. They invented different things. And the second contradiction is the contradiction on Judas' death. Like, how did Judas die? Now we have 2 options. One is that he hanged himself. Matthew 27 says that Judas threw the silver pieces into the temple and left, and he went and hanged himself. On the other hand, Acts seems to contradict this, and it says that Judas fell and burst open. He says that with the payment he received, he bought a field, then he fell headlong, his body burst, and his intestines spilled out, right? So it's not only that he fell in the field, it's also the fact that Judas apparently bought a field with that money, so he couldn't have thrown it onto the temple, right? So there's another contradiction there. Like, who bought the field? And in fact, you look at the entire story, there is yet another element that is contradictory, which is why is the field known as field of blood? And Matthew has one explanation, Acts has another explanation. So this one story has multiple discrepancies or contradictions. So that's another issue that affects reliability. So argument number 4, there are unrealistic events. And one of these is, I think, the cleansing of the temple. And this is a famous story when Jesus enters the temple and he sees the merchants buying and selling animals there, and he flips the tables, right? And then the gospel says that he forbade anyone from buying or selling stuff into the temple, right? And what is unrealistic about this is that the temples, we also hear from the gospel that there were money changers and money lenders in the temple. They had their bags of money right there, the tables, right? So nobody's going to have a bag of money and no have any guards to guard this, right? There's going to be some kind of security, right? Or people are going to have swords themselves. People used to carry swords and long knives back then. It was a very common thing. When they go to arrest Jesus, what does Peter do? He takes a sword and attacks one of the persons, right? So if Jesus walk into the temple where people have their bags of money and the tables and their goods and they're selling them, and he just starts flipping them, the tables, what's going to happen? Somebody's going to to attack him with a sword. Someone's going to punch him. Like, this is going to be a mess. It's not going to be like the Gospels say, right? So that's what I think. That's one example. Second example of an unrealistic event is the releasing of Barabbas. All four Gospels contain this story. They say the Pilate released Barabbas around Passover. Pilate had this tradition of releasing a prisoner. The problem is that Josephus makes no mention of this tradition. And this is weird because Josephus mentions a lot of stuff about the political, or these kind of things, or the political, of traditions of Pilate, or political stuff. And this is a quote by Bart Ehrman. He says, "We don't have any evidence of any Roman governor anywhere on any of the provinces having such a policy. Are we supposed to believe that the ruthless Iron Fist Pilate would release an enemy of the state because the Jewish crowd would have liked him to do so? Barabbas was an insurrection and a murderer. So what did Romans do with insurrectionists? Did they set them free so they could engage in more armored guerrilla warfare? Of course not, right? That's another thing. Barabbas was a murderer and a very serious crime. I think you don't release that guy, so he's going to go and kill more people. I don't think so. And the last point is that historians didn't mention Jesus' miracles, right? According to the Gospels, Jesus was super famous. News about him spread all over the region. He performed miracles that were very public, like, for example, the feeding of the 5,000. You have a crowd of 5,000 is huge, right? And people recognize him on the street or whatever. So given this, I think it's a bit strange that he wasn't mentioned by more contemporary historians, right? Only Josephus maybe mentions it, but even then, many people question that, because there are many scholars that have said that this passage, the Testimonium Fabianum, or something, they say that this is an interpolation. So even that, we are not really sure if he mentioned him or not. And even then, it's only one paragraph in the middle of many, many books. It's very little. So there are some people that could have mentioned Jesus: Nicholas of Damascus, Justus of Tiberian, Philo of Alexandria, Dio Cassio, right? They wrote about Judean affairs, or stuff like that. So they could have mentioned Jesus, but they didn't. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I hope that's not too many things. I hope there's not too many different arguments.
1 minute.
Yeah, because of time. That's all I had.
All right, perfect. So now we'll go to the two rebuttal periods, starting with Phil's 10-minute rebuttal against Juan's opening. Are you ready to go, Phil? Oh, I think you're muted. Hello?
Sure.
Oh, all right. So
Sorry about that.
No worries. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, that was a great presentation, Juan. I appreciate it. It was well thought out and organized, and so you get an A+ for that presentation. Absolutely. So let me see if I can take them one by one, and first of all, the fact that the resurrection is a priori unlikely is something that I absolutely agree with. So it was unlikely, and there are a lot of things that are fantastically unlikely and improbable, but they occur every day. The fact that I met my wife out of the millions of people in this country, there's 330 million people in this country. The fact that I actually met her out of all those millions of people and got married to her is fantastically improbable. So if you were to look at both of us when we were born and then say, what are the chances that this person would marry this person in decades from now? The chances would be absolutely astronomically against, but it still happened. So the fact that something is unlikely has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not it actually happened. So I don't think that argument really holds any water. And the other thing is that David Hume, his reasoning was extremely problematic, because based on his reasoning, and I can't get into it in detail today because there's too much material there, but the reason that his posture on all these things is so problematic is that it would rule out all sorts of things that occur every day because they were unlikely and because they don't align with people's experience. Of course, the resurrection of Christ is not aligned with people's everyday experience, but that has no bearing on whether or not it was true. It's simply another way of saying, yeah, this is very unlikely. So somebody would come up and say they could say Jesus probably didn't rise from the dead, and I would say I agree. He probably didn't rise from the dead. The probability is very low that Jesus rose from the dead. But this is not about probability. Probability has nothing to do with it. It's the wrong question. The question is, did it happen? Is there historical evidence that it occurred? And my reply would be, yeah, there is historical evidence that occurred. So probability is pretty much a meaningless argument at this point. And so I would recommend that people abandon that argument because it's just too weak. It's not an argument that deserves anybody's real consideration or anything. Now, you mentioned the contradictions in the Bible or in the Gospels, and the examples that you cite are not contradictions. I just published a book called Deconstructing Junk Theology, and I have a very lengthy, the longest chapter in the book deals with the apparent or alleged contradictions in the Gospels. And I would be happy to send you that book at no charge, Juan. If you would read it, I would love to send it to you. I would write a note in it and and add a card, because I'm one of your biggest fans. So I would love to send you my book if you'd be interested in reading it. If I send it to you and you just put it on your shelf, then that's not what I would want to happen. So if I say I went to the mall today and I saw a person at the mall shopping for sunglasses, and then someone else went to the mall the same day and they went to the same store and they said, I saw 5 people shopping for sunglasses in that store. Do those contradict each other? No, not at all. Because the idea, the claim that I saw one person shopping for sunglasses does not contradict the claim that someone saw 5 people shopping for sunglasses. The fact that I saw one person shopping for sunglasses is still true, even if it's incomplete. So I may have said I saw a person shopping for sunglasses, and the reason that I noticed it and the reason that I said that was because that person had a cane and it looked like they were blind. Well, some people will use a cane even if they're only mostly blind, but not completely blind. And sometimes people will wear sunglasses because their eyes are sensitive, even though they're mostly blind. So I might have noticed that it was odd that an apparent blind person was shopping for sunglasses. And so that's why I said, I noticed one person shopping for sunglasses today. So whenever you read historical accounts, you always have to recognize that the author of that historical account has a specific intent. There's something that they want to emphasize. And there's some kind of aspect of the story that they think is important, and the next author of an account of the same historical event might consider other details more important. And so there's always going to be a variation in the accounts of various historical authors, and that does not mean that they are contradicting each other. That simply means that they are emphasizing different parts of the story that they think is important. And so the idea that one angel and 2 angels were at the tomb, that's not a contradiction, not at all. Because the fact that 2 angels were at the tomb doesn't contradict the fact that there was 1 angel at the tomb. Maybe the 1 angel was speaking And that's why the author wanted to focus on the one angel at the tomb, because that angel was speaking at the time. And maybe the other angel never spoke. And so it would be natural for one historian to just mention one angel because that was the angel that was speaking. So that's not a contradiction at all. And the other contradictions that you raise, they're not contradictions. The fact that Judas hung himself and the fact that he fell on the ground and his intestines spilled out, those are not contradictory. Both of those can be true. He can hang himself and then fall on the ground and his intestines can spill out. So there's no contradiction there, none whatsoever. But the other point that I need to make is that even if the Gospels contain contradictions, that has no bearing on whether Christ rose from the dead. Has zero bearing on whether Christ rose from the dead. And so that argument really fails to address whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. And then the argument from the anonymity of the Gospels, that's also irrelevant, because you can read a historical account and you can apply what historians call the internal evidence test. And you can identify people who are giving us eyewitness testimony. So the author of a given historical account has no bearing on, or who the author is has no bearing on whether or not the account passes the internal evidence test. Because if you can identify that someone is giving you an eyewitness account of something, and that there are multiple people who are attesting to the same event, then the authorship of that historical account is completely irrelevant.
1 minute.
So, okay. So we don't need to know who wrote the Gospels to know that they are historical. The other thing that you mentioned was, why are there no historians that mention the resurrection or that mention Jesus? And the truth is, there are historians who mention Jesus. They are the historians that wrote the Gospels. The Gospels are the first century historical record of Jesus. So when people say, how come no historians wrote about Jesus? Well, the Gospels are the historians that wrote about Jesus. So there they are. There's the answer to your question right there. The fact that they eventually ended up in the Bible is something that you would naturally expect to happen. So if it was serious history, and Luke, by the way, is a first-rate historian, you can tell that he gathered all sorts of sources and all sorts of data and all sorts of information. He compiled it in a systematic way. So he was an absolute top-rate historian. And if you have a historian of his caliber writing about the resurrection of Jesus, you don't need any other historians. There are cases in ancient history where we have only one source for a historical event, but nobody rejects whether or not that event occurred simply only because there's only one source. If that was the case, we would have to throw out 80% of all of history, of all the history of mankind. So
Okay. All right. So, all right, cool. So I will turn it over to Juan for his 10-minute rebuttal. Obviously, Phil had about an extra minute there. So if you need an extra minute, I'll give that to you as well, out of fairness. But
sorry.
no problem. Just so you know, do you guys hear those chimes? No. Okay. So never mind. I'll just come in. But yeah. So Juan, are you ready for your 10-minute rebuttal?
Yeah.
Okay. So 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay. So thank you, Phil, for that argument. I think it was a very interesting argument. So and thank you for the kind words at the beginning. Okay. So the first claim I want to address is the one about falsifiability, and it's the argument that the resurrection could have been falsified by producing the body of Jesus. And one important thing to say here, I think Del Allison points out the fact that a body can become unrecognizable only about in 3 days. Actually, it doesn't take that a lot of time for the body to swell be to the point that it's not so easy to recognize the features. And this will have been especially true for somebody who was crucified and may have been beaten, got a crown of thorns in his face, or the face will have been bloodied, beaten, right? So it could be that it was difficult to recognize. And if we look at the Gospels, we see that the disciples, they didn't start preaching the resurrection at the beginning, like at the very next day. The Gospels say that they waited for the Holy Spirit, I think for about a week, until the Holy Spirit and Pentecost took place, and the Holy Spirit came. So at the very least, at the very minimum, you have 3 days plus about a week, right, for them to start preaching this. So it could be that that in this in this time span, the body became unrecognizable. Another possible option about this, and some skeptics have proposed this. I don't like going this route, but some skeptics say that maybe someone indeed stole the body of Jesus. Maybe that's how, in fact, they say maybe that's how this whole delusion started, right? Someone steals this body for some reason, and then the disciples do find the empty tomb, and they think, oh my God, it must be that he resurrected, right? That's, for example, James Tabor is a relatively famous skeptic that makes this case. He says, he didn't say the body got stolen. He says that maybe Joseph of Arimathea only intended to temporarily store that body of Jesus in that tomb, but later reburied it, and somehow there was some kind of confusion. The disciples were not informed about this, couldn't reach Joseph of Arimathea to clear off the confusion, and that's how the body disappears, and they end up believing that Jesus rose from the dead. Or maybe the body was in a graveyard, in some kind of graveyard, where later it wouldn't have been possible to know exactly, okay, which grave was Jesus. It was some kind of unmarked grave in a big criminal graveyard, and later on, like some weeks or months later, it's not so easy to say, okay, where was Jesus? And even if we knew where it was, it would be like we're not going to be able to recognize him anyway. So even if they do show the body, the Christians will be like, no, that's not Jesus. They're showing us a fake body because it's no longer recognizable. Okay. Another point, okay, the most important point is, okay, how the disciples end up believing that Jesus rose from the dead, right? And here I will appeal to two things. This will be bereavement hallucinations combined with cognitive dissonance. And the phenomenon of bereavement hallucination is that it's actually very common for some people to see a dead person that recently passed away, and to have hallucinations with this person's way they see him somehow alive. And we have many examples in the literature too, some of which are the person claims that they were very realistic experiences. Like they even claim, some people say that they touch the person or stuff like that, like widows who lose their husbands, right? Or sons, daughters who lose their mothers, their fathers. Like they say, oh yeah, I had a vision of this person, right? Maybe it was in a dream, maybe half dream, half awake state, and they end up, having a very, very big experience of the person. And what I think is that if this experience happens today, maybe back then when people were more superstitious, right? Maybe some people could end up believing that the Jesus has risen over such experiences. And another aspect of this is something called cognitive dissonance. And it's where a religious group, it happens mostly in a religious context, where people, something happens that really challenges their belief system, and they just cannot accept what happened, and they just end up somehow convincing themselves that something else must have happened, which removes some of the cognitive dissonance. For example, Kormanowski, a skeptic Kormanowski, in his book, he tells the example of a cult called the Seekers, who had a very specific prediction on when the world was going to end at a specific date. And when that day came and the world didn't end, they ended up making up all sorts of beliefs. So you see cognitive dissonance kicking in, and they somehow managed to convince themselves, oh, it must be that it was a spiritual thing. It must be that maybe what they say in this, I think the end of the world came, but it wasn't a spiritual way. And they end up doing all sorts of things like to convince themselves that this was true, because they don't want to accept that they were wrong. It's just too hard to accept for them, so they convince themselves. So I think in the case of the disciples, maybe they believe so strongly that Jesus is the Messiah and he's going to lead Israel to whatever the Messiah was going to do, to establish David's throne and all of that. And when they see him crucified and killed as a criminal, it's so hard to accept for them that the moment Peter or one of the disciples ended up having some bewitchment hallucinations, then he shares this with the others, and maybe they just end up somehow convincing themselves that, yeah, Jesus must have risen from the dead, right? And maybe some didn't believe and they left the movement. We don't know. We are not absolutely sure that, like, Bartholomew was preaching actively after death of Philip or Thomas. We don't even know. There's not so certain. Like, we only know about Peter. For example, when Paul tells us about the time he went to Jerusalem, he tells us he only saw Peter and James, right? There's only two of them. And James wasn't even one of the 12. He was the brother of Jesus, which joined the movement afterwards, right? So we don't know if all of them became convinced. Maybe some of them did and left the movement. We don't even know, right? So yeah, and I think there was another argument. It was like about how the claiming, the proclamation of the resurrection was very public. So I think maybe we don't know exactly who were they telling this to at the beginning. Maybe they were telling only to the ones who were followers of Jesus previously, like only to the group. We were going to the inside the group and telling them, okay, Jesus has risen, right? Not to the external people, like in general. Maybe it was not like in the street, I don't know how public the proclamation was, right? They will be more inclined to believe it, right? To believe this, right? I think that's what I wanted to say here.
All right. So perfect. All right. So now we will go to the next section, the 15-minute cross-examine section, starting with Phil cross-examining Juan. So Phil, restrict yourself to just asking questions, and Juan, you are answering those questions for the next 15 minutes.
I'll try to restrict myself.
No problem. You guys are both ready there?
Sure.
Juan?
Yeah, sure.
All right. 3, 2, 1, go.
Am I starting asking the questions?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Okay. Yeah. So first of all, my first question would be, Juan, do you have any historical evidence that the disciples of Christ were hallucinating?
Hallucinating? No. Okay, I think no. If I'm going to point to something, maybe there is this story of appearances in Luke, where they say that Jesus had some kind of weird character. There was something weird about Jesus when he seemed to appear out of nowhere, he seemed to walk to walls. I don't remember exactly. I hope you know what I'm referring to. They say there is something weird about Jesus, and what I think is that this is consistent with hallucinations.
Okay. And do you have any historical evidence that some of the apostles may have just dropped out of the movement?
May have, I guess. No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. No.
Okay. So are the alternate explanations that you're referring to, are they a matter of extremely high probability, or are they a matter of speculation that is just simply designed to rescue the hypothesis that Jesus did not rise from the dead?
I guess, yeah, I guess you could say that, right? I mean, for me, it would be a matter of if I had to pick one, either Jesus rose from the dead or this other speculation scenario, right? I would go for that because of naturalistic human reasons, mostly that.
Okay. So, is it possible that the contradictions that you mentioned about the number of angels at the tomb and the fact that there are two different claims about Judas and so on, is it possible that those are actually not real contradictions?
I'm not sure about Judas. Honestly, I think it's too many problems about Judas. We can talk about that in detail. I can tell you why, because it's not just Judas. We have other things. Who bought the field? Why is the field called the field of blood? It's too many issues, I think. About the angel, yeah, I guess it's possible, maybe, but I find it a little that the gospel would have used a little bit of a weird wording if he wanted to say that. I just think it's an odd choice of word, but I guess it's possible.
Yeah. So do you have any historical evidence that the body was stolen?
No.
Okay. Do you have any historical evidence that the Romans who were put in charge of the body, according to the historical accounts, were so incompetent that it was possible for somebody to steal the body from them when their failure would have resulted in their execution?
I think it was the Jewish authorities in charge of that. Matthew is the one who says that, and even according to the story, I think the guards came to the tomb like the day after Jesus died, like a full day had passed by the time the guards were placed in the tomb. And another thing I would say, many scholars think that the guards at the tomb were an apologetic invention of Matthew. That's something many scholars say.
So do you think that it's probable? You're talking a lot about probability and so on. Do you think it's probable, because Roman soldiers were the ones who were guarding the tomb? It wasn't the Jewish temple guard. It was Roman soldiers. And so do you think that it's likely and probable that Roman soldiers could have gone over and had posted a guard on a tomb without checking the fact whether or not the tomb was really empty? In other words, how likely is it that Roman soldiers would be guarding a tomb where the body had already been stolen? I mean, are they that incompetent? How likely is it that they are that incompetent?
Okay. Which I do think is Jewish God. We have to look. We can look at the text, but I think it's Jewish God, not the Roman God. But let's imagine thing. The thing is, there is a heavy stone blocking the entry to the tomb. So if I imagine this, two guards go there, go outside the tomb to guard it, right? They go, they see, okay, the stone is there, right? And they're like, oh, that's too much work to move the stone, right? Or not to go check if the body is there. That's too much work. I don't feel like doing that. I'm just gonna stand here and guard the tomb, right? I think that's possible. I don't think it's so unlikely.
But is it likely? I mean,
yeah. If people, I work. Some people are really lazy. I don't know.
Okay. So when you say that there was a stone rolled in front of the tomb, do you believe that that's true?
Actually, I don't believe that it's true. I'm just more of a for the sake of the argument kind of thing. I don't believe that the burial story is historical.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then doesn't that weaken your case? Because you're saying that a stone was rolled in front of the tomb, but you're saying that you don't think that the historical accounts are reliable, and if they're not reliable, then why do you think that you can rely on the premise that the stone was rolled in front of the tomb?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're kind of mixing things here. Like, I granted this tomb for the sake of the argument, if you ask me what I think Jesus was buried in a criminal's graveyard, not by Joseph of Arimathea, but by the authorities in general. I don't think Joseph of Arimathea gave him his personal tomb, like the gospel says. So I think he was placed in some normal grave in the ground in a criminal's graveyard. That's what I think will be the more likely to happen.
Okay. When the historical accounts in the Gospels say that Jesus was wrapped up and that his body was treated according to Jewish customs, where there's some kind of paste was and then his body was wrapped and then in spices and this kind of it's almost like plaster is kind of the best way to describe that. Do you think that is an accurate representation of what occurred?
No, personally, I don't believe that, because I find it weird that they will do this for a criminal. I find it like, why would I do this for a criminal? It's weird, a bit weird to me.
Okay. Well, so aren't you being rather selective about what you are accepting in the historical account and what you're not, based on how convenient it is for you to either accept or reject certain aspects of the story?
Yeah. Well, the reason I reject the burial story is not just because it's inconvenient for my thesis. The reason is because I think it will be unlikely for Joseph of Arimathea to do this for a criminal. I just find it weird and unlikely a priori. So that's why that's my reasoning here. And I also think that it will be too risky for Joseph of Arimathea to do these kind of things. It makes little sense to me.
Are you aware that Joseph of Arimathea was a disciple of Christ and that he appeared, that they met? Actually, you can read the account in John chapter 3 where Joseph and Jesus actually met and had a conversation, and that there is a tradition, there's a long-standing tradition that Joseph was actually a rich man and that he was actually a disciple of Christ. Are you aware of those things?
Okay, I'm not aware of the conversation on John chapter 3. Maybe I'm forgetting it. I don't know. But what I think for me is, it's unlikely that a guy in the Jewish Sanhedrin will be a disciple of Jesus. And even if he was, I think he will keep this a secret because it will be too dangerous for him. The way I see it is he's in the high council, and for him to openly show that he's a disciple of Jesus will be too dangerous, because they will be looking at disciples of Jesus to maybe arrest them also. And for him to do that, he will be risking his job, like his life maybe. So that's what I think here.
Okay. Are you aware that that meeting occurred at night and that it was done in secret, and that it actually states in the Gospels that Joseph was afraid that people would actually think that he was a disciple, and that's why they met at night, and that's why he kept the whole thing secret?
No, I don't. I'm not aware of that. I know what the Gospel says, that Joseph took courage for him to go to Pilate and ask him for the body. Right? But at that point, that will have been public. The moment where he retrieves the body and takes it to his tomb.
Do you think there are any other explanations as to why Joseph of Arimathea would go to Pilate and ask for the body, other than that? Well, are there any explanations for the fact that he went to Pilate and that he could have gotten away with it? Because, I mean, there's lots of different ways that he could justify that without giving away the the fact that he might have been a disciple. Can you think of any other explanations as to how that could have been realistic?
Maybe, yeah, I guess maybe is there a way that Joseph can do this without giving out that he's a disciple of Jesus? I guess maybe. I don't see why not. I don't know why, but they will ask him like, okay, why are you only getting Jesus? Why aren't you getting the other two tips, for example? Or they will ask him, why are you putting him in your personal, private tomb, which is your family tomb, right? So I'm not sure what he could say there, like as to not give away that he's a disciple of Jesus.
Are you aware that Joseph of Arimathea was very wealthy?
Yeah.
And do you understand that wealthy people in ancient Israel like that could have lots of influence, and that there are times when people in society don't necessarily challenge wealthy people because they're afraid of wealthy people and because the power that they wield because of their wealth?
Yeah. But the other guys, Jewish guys in the council, they would have been just as wealthy as he and would have also have the same influence. So it's someone below him may not challenge him, but his other fellow Jewish council members, they may challenge him. What are you doing? We just condemned this guy today. What are you doing, putting him in your own family? Tom, maybe are you one of his followers?
So do you have any historical evidence of what you just said? That the other Jews in the Sanhedrin would have, might have questioned him or anything like that? I mean, do you have the evidence? What I'm trying to get at here is I want to know if you can give me evidence that these things are actually true, or whether you're just bringing them up as ad hoc explanations.
Yeah, no, I don't think. I think this is just what I find reasonable that it could happen. Like what I find reasonable, it will happen given the scenario that we know. And one thing that I could show you, for example, in Mark, they told us that the authorities tried to grab a guy because they thought he was with Jesus, right? The disciples fled and they tried to grab another guy. So as to say, the followers of Jesus, they are in danger. It's dangerous to be perceived as a follower of Jesus, from what Mark tells us. So if you think, okay, given that, then it makes sense for Joseph of Arimathea to want not to out himself as a disciple, as a secret disciple, because then it could also be risky for him in the same way.
Okay, so you can't think of any explanations as to how that would have been something that's feasible or realistic in that first century, because we can talk about other alternate explanations as to what gave him that confidence and how he could justify it with that and get away with it. And I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is do you think that historical investigation should be based on what we think might be reasonable, or do you think historical investigation should be based on actual evidence instead of just simply a subjective assertion as to what one thinks is reasonable?
Yeah, I think you have to look at both. You have to look at what the evidence, historical evidence says, but you also have to consider, is this plausible, is this reasonable, or is this possible to be an invention or a legend, right? And the way I think is, if you already accept that there may have been some legends in the gospel, there may have been some material that was invented. If you already think that there was some stuff invented, then it is easier and less ad hoc to say, okay, maybe that part of the burial that was also invented, right? If you already agree with the possibility that the possibility of invention is there, then you can justify this.
All right, so that's the 15-minute there. So now we're going to switch gears. Now it's time for Juan to have fun and grill Phil with his cross-examination. So Juan, you're going to be restricted to just asking questions, and Phil, you're just going to be answering those questions. So are both of you guys ready to go?
Turn up the heat.
Turn up the heat. Juan, you're ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, so 3, 2, 1, let's do it.
Okay. So Phil, let me ask you something. Let's say we have a document, an ancient document saying Joe built a house. And then we have a second ancient document saying Joe lifted a mountain, right? Now, you think that the criteria of historicity for the first document, like the evidence we need for the first document to be considered true, is the same as the one we will need for the second document to be true? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. You think
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah,
I know
okay.
what you mean. The answer is that evidence is evidence. The nature of evidence, it has nothing to do with the nature of the claim.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great siege to my question. Would you agree that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?
No,
Oh, you don't agree with that?
no. I think that's a vacuous claim that has no grounding in any objectivity whatsoever. And the reason I think that is because I had this conversation with several atheists. I had the conversation with John Loftus a couple of years ago. And I asked John, I said, John, what is it? What criteria would you offer to establish a claim as extraordinary? And what criteria would you offer to establish a claim as to establish evidence as extraordinary? And he couldn't answer the question. And the point that I was making is that the term extraordinary is completely subjective in that principle. And so if you can't give me, or not you personally, but if the skeptic who believes in this principle can't give me a criteria for what counts as extraordinary, then the principle is completely devoid of meaning. It's completely subjective. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence for a claim that someone subjectively believes is extraordinary, it only has to be sufficient evidence. It doesn't have to be extraordinary evidence, because it's a category mistake to say that because a claim is extraordinary, the evidence for it must also be extraordinary. And that's a category mistake, and that is a completely subjective standard, and so that's why I reject that entire principle in wholesale. I was looking for the word, so.
Yeah, so you spoke about how technology doesn't replace testimony, right? Mm-hmm. But don't you think that when we have, for example, footage of a security camera showing that a crime took place, don't you think that this makes the evidence, the total case, now much stronger? Like with that footage, now the case for the prosecution becomes bulletproof, right? Becomes super good. And without that footage, it will be weaker. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, without evidence, a case is definitely weaker. But that's not the issue. The issue is does human testimony play a role in digital or in technological evidence and technological footage? And the answer to that question is it absolutely plays a role, because somebody has to testify that camera was pointed in the right direction, that recording was made on a specific date and time. And someone has to testify that they calibrated that camera equipment, that they set the clock in that camera correctly. And so you could have footage that says this happened on December 20th, 2025, and it shows some person breaking in and stealing or something like that. But somebody has to give testimony that says, yeah, I set that camera's clock correctly. The date and time on that camera was set correctly. Just the fact that there is footage that has a date and time on it does not prove anything. There has to be a human testimony involved that says, yeah, I set the date and time on that camera, and maybe somebody else, a technician or coworker, might have verified it or something like that. So human testimony always plays a role, even if the absence of that footage is weaker than the presence of the footage. The question is there any evidence that a specific crime took place? In your example, I think it's a crime that's been caught on footage. And so if that camera is the only evidence available, then that evidence is stronger than the fact that there is no footage available. But if there is human testimony that says I saw so-and-so enter that building, And if there's a witness to the crime, a human witness, then suddenly everything changes. Suddenly you have human testimony, you have an eyewitness to the case. And so that's the case with the resurrection. You can't just compare the resurrection to there was a camera available, or if a camera was theoretically available to capture the event, that evidence is stronger than the absence of that camera that was available to capture that event, because we have human testimony that is multi-layered, that it comes from multiple sources. And so it's simply not the case that we're comparing a theoretical camera that could have gone back in time and captured the resurrection, and the lack of a theoretical camera that could have gone back in time and captured the resurrection. That's not really a valid comparison.
Right. Okay, that's good. So you say that the disciples, we know that they were not insane, right? You say that they wouldn't write well or talk well or something like that. Are you aware that there are some professional writers and some even famous people that have problems with schizophrenia or stuff like that, mental issues?
Mm-hmm.
So you agree that there are at least some insane people that can appear loose, can appear well spoken, right? Like you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Because you say like no, if they were insane, we could tell, right?
Yeah, and schizophrenic people with mental illness, first of all, you don't find this exact same mental illness among multiple people that are involved in a particular historical context. So everybody who was a witness to the resurrection of Jesus would have to have had the exact same mental illness. They all would have had to have the exact same schizophrenia. And so if you're fond of considering likelihood, I would turn that back and offer it back to you and say, how likely is it that so many people all suffered from the exact same mental illness in the exact same way, and it led them to the exact same conclusion? And so I don't think that's a reasonable objection. I don't think it's a reasonable course of investigation at all. And the other thing is that people with mental illnesses are usually not willing to die for the claims that they're making. People with mental illness don't have that kind of moral stability and moral courage. That's just something that you don't find among people who are mentally ill. Now, they're willing to sacrifice somebody else's life, and they might be willing to do violence in order to try to advance their cause, but they're usually not willing to be put to death for something that their mental illness has simply conjured up out of thin air.
Yes. So let me ask you this. Do we have the first-hand account, a personal account of Thomas, for example, saying that he saw the risen Jesus?
Well, in the historical accounts, Thomas actually had an encounter with the risen Jesus, and Jesus invited him to touch his wound and to put his hand in his side and say, see for yourself, touch for yourself, see it, touch it. I'm offering you tactile evidence that I am alive. And when Thomas saw those things, he fell to his knees and said, my Lord and my God. And so Thomas was convinced by the appearance of the risen Christ, according to the historical narrative. So he didn't need to have firsthand eyewitness experience of the actual event itself, the resurrection. The evidence that he received was the fact that Jesus was standing in front of him, and he knew it was Jesus, and he knew Jesus was alive, and he saw the the wounds in his hands and in his side.
Right.
So we don't need a historical, an actual witness of the event itself from Thomas.
Right. Yeah, but that's my point. It's not like, is this from Thomas himself or from a secondary account later on saying that this is what Thomas did and saw, right?
Yeah, all of this is historical narrative that compiles eyewitness testimony and then categorizes it, organizes it, systematized it, and wrote it down so that other people can consume that historical data. So historical data is compiled and arranged or organized in multiple systematic ways. Sometimes it's firsthand testimony. Sometimes it's testimony from somebody who testifies that somebody else actually testified to it. And so there's a variety of different ways where that historical narrative can come about, and all of those things can be verified. They're not stories that somebody is telling and just simply asking someone to believe it. That's, if you ever read Simon Greenleaf, I would highly recommend that you read Simon Greenleaf. Simon Greenleaf is I think he was a historian, but he was an attorney. And Simon Greenleaf said, I know evidence. I know what evidence is. And I know that the historical accounts of the resurrection of Jesus Christ are good evidence. And that this is evidence that's reliable, because people make it their life's work to study the nature of evidence itself. And they know how to examine the evidence, and they know how to treat it. They know how to put it to the test. And since they know how to test it so well, they're able to identify what good evidence is. And there's an army of attorneys and scholars in the criminal defense world, the criminal prosecution world, who have looked at the evidence for the resurrection of Christ and said, I know what evidence is, and that's good evidence.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we have a couple of minutes. We can talk about the contradiction thing. So I have an interesting question.
So you're at a minute and a half left.
Okay. Maybe if a body is hanging, right, and the rope snaps or something, and it falls, does it fall head first? You know what head first, headlong means? It's like with the head, like this is the head, the fall like this. Now, does it fall like this, or does it fall like this? These are the feet, these are the head. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, how does the hang body fall? Would it fall like this, or would it fall like this?
That depends.
On what? How will it normally fall?
Well, it depends on how high that person was. You can fall from a great height where where your head was above your feet first, but while you're falling, your body could actually invert. You could have hit a branch on the way down, and your body could have hit head first, even though it was hanging with its head above its feet. So we simply can't speculate and say that it was unlikely that he hit his head first, that he fell head first when he was hanging with his head above his feet. That's just simply there's no substance to that whatsoever. There's all sorts of ways that a body could fall headlong when they were originally hanged.
All right, so we are out of time there, so perfect. So now we'll get to, I think, Phil's favorite part, the informal dialogue. So letting both of you guys off the leash. You guys can engage each other. Obviously, I know you guys will be respectful and not interrupting and stuff like that, and being as concise as you can to respect the other. But now we have about 30 minutes or so of informal dialogue between you two. So let me just add that to the clock. So yeah, I will let it over to you guys, to whoever wants to initiate. If you guys are ready. All right. So 3, 2, 1, go for it.
Okay.
Juan, you can start. Be happy to do that.
Yeah. I don't know. Let's. What do you think about the hypothesis that maybe some bewitchment hallucinations were involved in explaining why Peter or some of the disciples end up believing in Jesus?
Yeah, I've heard the hallucination theory. I mean, I don't mean to be uncharitable or anything like that, but you haven't brought anything up that I haven't heard before. These are all very standard, very common objections to the resurrection. And I think that every single one of them have been answered multiple times in the literature. And I don't see any force in, I don't see a force of argument here, because the idea that they all hallucinated and all had the exact same hallucinations and that it all produced the exact same conclusions in each one of those people it violates the very rules of likelihood that you actually presented at the beginning of the debate. If you want to talk about how unlikely something is, and that if it's unlikely, that's going to drive you to the conclusion that it didn't happen, then I would apply that same criteria to the hallucination theory. The hallucination theory is so unlikely and so strained that if unlikelihood leads you to doubt something, then unlikelihood should lead you to doubt that hallucination theory, because it is so stretched, it's so far-fetched. And also a lot of experts in the field of psychology have testified and have actually commented on this, and they say that you don't have masses of people all sharing the same hallucination. That's simply so statistically unlikely and improbable that it doesn't even deserve a thinking person's consideration. So I just think the and the other problem that I have with the hallucination theory is that it is speculation. And that's why I was trying to drive home this idea that historical facts are not established through speculation, they're established through evidence. And this hallucination theory is not evidence, it's simply speculation. It's simply a possible explanation, and a possible explanation does not count as historical evidence.
Right. So no, I agree that the idea that all of them hallucinated, right, the same thing, that's too weird, that's too unlikely, right? I like
your word weird.
Yeah. Well, maybe try to do a more modest claim that maybe 2 or 3 had an oscillation or vision of Jesus, and they somehow managed to convince the group and get them excited about it, and they will be like, oh, and through social pressure or cognitive group spirit, cognitive bias, they will be like a cult, that sometimes people get into cults, they end up being convinced and believing some weird things, and it can happen. So I would say maybe something like that. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll give you my personal opinion on it, but other scholars have actually made the same observation. Social pressure does not give people the courage to die for a claim. And the other thing is that if someone has an hallucination does not give someone the courage to die for a claim. It doesn't give them the courage to repeatedly make that claim in public and to testify to something that they say that they've seen and heard. That it doesn't give them the courage to do that. It just simply doesn't. That is not, I don't think that's a realistic explanation of the courage that the apostles had, that all of them had. And I don't think you can explain that courage by social pressure or hallucination or mental illness.
Yeah, so we say that the disciples died for their faith in the resurrection, but How do we know this? Like, how many disciples ended up dying over this? Do you know that?
All 12 were martyred except for John, who wrote on the island, who was exiled to the island of Patmos.
Right,
as far as we know, John was not martyred.
Yeah. John died of old age. But what I have seen, the traditions about these disciples, many of them are legendary, and they're not really taken as historical. Do you know, like, what are the sources, for example, that Philip died for his faith, or that Bartolomeo died for his faith? Do you know what the sources are?
I don't know. I don't have the sources memorized, but I've had discussions with scholars. And one of my favorite scholars is Dr. Craig Blomberg, who is a distinguished professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary. And he is a friend of mine. He and I go back decades. And he and I used to meet for lunch once a month, and we would have discussions about all of these things. We would have discussions about apologetics, about textual criticism, historical claims and historical evidence, and those kinds of things. And I would be happy to have him come on, and we could do a follow-up to this debate, and he could give you his expertise on the historical evidence for the fact that the disciples were martyred for their faith and martyred for their testimony. So I don't have that data in front of me that I can't rattle it off just out of memory at the moment. But some people will frown on the term tradition, and they think tradition is simply a cultural habit. But there's another word, there's another meaning, another definition of the word tradition, and that is historical tradition. And that relies on historical testimony, and it relies on memory, and it relies on people who do have sources. And even if the original source material has been lost, the tradition still goes on, and it still perpetuates itself. And not only that, but you have tradition that is shared by a group or a variety of different historians. And so that is a valid form of historical evidence, even if it's not something where you can trace down the source and reproduce it. And Craig could explain all that because he has a PhD in this stuff, and so he is a first-rate scholar on first and second and third century history, and so I think it would be great to have that conversation. But I don't know any scholars who actually claim that those historical narratives about the disciples having been martyred are false. I don't see any historical evidence that actually supports the claim that they were not martyred for their faith. Like Peter died of old age. There's no historical evidence for that. And there's no scholar that comes up that has any evidence that Peter died of old age. The normal historical momentum has been that Peter was crucified upside down out of reverence for Christ, because he didn't think that he was worthy to be crucified right side up like Christ was. And so, I don't think that there's any serious basis for which that you could build a case where you would want to doubt whether or not those stories and those narratives are actually true and reliable. So.
Yeah. Craig Blomberg is huge, right? It's very famous. It's great. It's a very great thing. Also, but there's another guy that talks a lot about this. Sean McDowell.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has specialized in this topic of the martyr of the disciples. And what he says nowadays, he admits that we cannot really tell for certainty that all of these disciples died for the faith. He agrees that sometimes the case is like overmade, like the apologists exaggerate a little bit. And he thinks that only Peter, Paul, maybe James, we have good sources for James. James is in Acts, I think the son of Zebedee, in Acts tells us that Herod killed James. And I think that's all. Like when he says, like, we consider like historically certain, he says that's only those, right? He thinks that for the other ones, the sources are not so good. Like in particular, there are some of them, like Philip or Andrew. The sources are actually the apocryphal gospels, right? If we look at that, these are the sources, the earliest sources. These are not good sources. Like people do not consider this to be historical. And he says that the apologists have to like tone down the claim a little bit, not make the strong claim that all the disciples died for the faith, but instead he says they were at least willing to die and be persecuted, so at least willing to risk it for the faith. Like he says that because he thinks the historical evidence is not so strong, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I would frame the question this way. And by the way, you're doing a great job with this. This is, I give you an A+ for your whole participation in this debate. This is, I'm not talking to somebody who hasn't done their homework, and I appreciate that. So,
Thanks.
You're not wasting my time at all. It's never a waste of my time talking to you. So thanks for that. But I think that here's the question, or this is the way that I would frame the question. If only half of the disciples were martyred for their faith, or if a lot of them, if you could seriously call into question the claim that most of them died for their faith, or even that all of them died for their faith, would it change anything? And my answer is no, it wouldn't change a thing, because they showed that kind of courage when they were preaching in Jerusalem the resurrection of Christ long before they came to the end of their lives. They were preaching that resurrection message all along, and they were doing it courageously, even in the face of persecution. We know that Peter and John were thrown into prison and beaten savagely for preaching the gospel. And when the Jewish authorities let them out of jail, they said, "Okay, you better stop preaching. You better stop doing this, because if you don't, we're gonna arrest you again. We're gonna beat you again, and we're gonna keep beating you until you stop." And you can read that in Acts. I think it's Acts chapter 5. You can read where they were beaten savagely within an inch of their lives, probably. They were thrown in jail. And then when they were released from jail, it says, and the next day they went out and started preaching the resurrection again. So this actually shows unflinching courage. And so even if they weren't martyred for their faith, the fact remains that their courage was unstoppable. They simply wouldn't stop, even in the face of persecution at the time, early. So I think that's really probably the more important issue to focus on is that their unflinching courage was there throughout the whole process. So you can tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, it is. What I think about it is a very central issue. I would say this comes from Acts, right? Most of this, right? Peter getting thrown in jail and all of that. They getting beaten. But here's my question: how do we know that Acts is reliable history? Because as far as I know, skeptics don't really grant the historicity of Acts, right? Many skeptics do question it. And for example, I will point out something. I think there is a chapter in Acts at the beginning where they tell us about how they put Peter in jail. And they told us that Peter had 16 soldiers guarding him, right? A whole squad. And then it tells us that an angel came, he put the soldiers to sleep and brought Peter out of jail. And I wonder, isn't this maybe a sign of a bit of invention or exaggerate embellishment going on here, because the story sounds a bit too fantastical. Like, why would Herod put so many soldiers watching Peter, right? An angel came and broke Peter out of jail, and the historians didn't mention this, or Herod, the scribes of Herod didn't mention any of this. So it's like, okay, isn't this maybe weird? How do we know that Acts is reliable, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a long conversation in class and then out of class with a professor of logic that I had at the University of Colorado. And he was a huge skeptic as far as historical narratives that contain supernatural elements. And his argument was that if a historical claim contains, or if a historical narrative contains some kind of supernatural event, then that historical narrative should be automatically held under suspicion because it contains a supernatural event. And so what I tried to explain to him was that the idea that the supernatural tends to negate the credibility of a historical narrative is a philosophical predisposition. It's a philosophical prejudice. It's not a historical. It's not a matter of historical discipline. In other words, there's nothing in historiography that rules out the nature or the reliability of a historical account just because it has some supernatural element in it. That is simply an antecedent predisposition against the supernatural. It's not a historiography principle. It's a philosophical bias. And you can't use a philosophical bias to try to indict a historical account simply because it contains something that you have a bias against. And so, and by the way, he gave me an A+ in that class because he didn't agree with me, and he actually didn't like me very much because I was a thorn in his side. I would constantly ask questions in his class that he couldn't answer, and so he didn't like me very much. But he gave me an A+ because he said, "Yeah, your objections are logically valid. I can't actually refute your objections and your points, and so I'm going to give you an A+ because you haven't failed in conducting rational, logical analysis. I just don't like your ideology." And so I think the main point is, and I don't want to belabor this. I think I'm rambling here a little bit, which I tend to do. But the main point is that you can't use a philosophical bias to judge a historical account.
Yeah. Okay. There was something you mentioned earlier. I think it was very interesting about probabilities, right? Things can be very complex things. You say, for example, that the claim that you made your wife is something improbable because a priori, if we go back behind enough in the past, what are the odds that you will meet this specific woman, out of all the women in the world? But I'm not sure this is the right way to think about probabilities. I'm going to give you an example. Like, let's say you have this coin, and I'm going to flip it, right? So what are the probabilities that is going to fall heads? I think it's 50%, right? But what if someone said, okay, no, the probability is that the coin is going to turn heads. You have to go back in time, think out of all the coins in the world that exist, what are the odds that you will take this specific coin and you will flip it at this specific second, and that this specific second it will fall heads. And for me, I think I'm not sure why. There is something about that just feels wrong. It feels like it's missing the point a little bit about when we talk about what is probable, what is improbable. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that the probability question really relies on the concept that something is rare. The reason that people say that something is improbable that is because it is so rare that something like this happens that it is simply improbable that it would happen.
Yeah.
It's extremely rare that you might find a 4-leaf clover in a field of grass. A 4-leaf clover is extremely rare, and so finding one is going to be extremely improbable. And all of that adds up to, yeah, it's probably unlikely that I'm going to find a 4-leaf clover, but people have found 4-leaf clovers, so it has happened. And so I just don't think that the probability argument really works with the resurrection, because like I said before, I agree that the resurrection was improbable. And I would even go so far as to say that Jesus probably didn't rise from the dead. But that proposition is not incompatible with the proposition Jesus did rise from the dead. It was very improbable, but it happened. Just like it's improbable that I met this particular woman when I could have met thousands and hundreds of thousands of others. It's improbable that this is the woman that I met and that this is the woman that I married. It's improbable that I found her, because she is a rare individual. She's very unique. There's nobody like my wife, and nobody. And not even you, Juan. As much as I like you, you know, my wife is even more rare, you know. And so I guess the whole conclusion is that the fact that something is rare and improbable, it really has no impact on whether or not it actually occurred. If you want to know whether it occurred, you have to examine the evidence for it. You can't just simply be content to say, well, it's so improbable that I'm just not going to believe it. I'm just going to reject it, because what that does is that ignores the evidence in favor of probability, and I just don't think that's a wise approach. You know.
Okay. Yeah. You know, there is this human aspect of you know, human arguments against miracles. All very interesting topic, and one important part of it is something that is called the reference class problem. And it's, for example, if you're going to do a frequentist approach to probability, you have to pick the right reference class. And what some atheists do is that they look at the wrong reference class. For example, they look people who have died, how many of those have resurrected, right? I think that's the wrong reference class, because what the Christian is not saying is like that all the people who die has some probability of resurrecting, right? But I think the right reference class will be stories, ancient stories with supernatural elements. And if we look at all the stories we have with supernatural elements, we see how many of these are because they have myths or legend or someone lied, right? And how many of these are true? And the problem is that the ones that are true is almost zero, right? There are 0 confirmed cases of this. So it will be extremely rare, right? So if we have a story, and especially an ancient story from this superstitious age, I could say there are just so many legends, so many myths, and we look at so many of these documents, and so many of them are myths, that probably this one is also a myth. It's like a part of the group, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, and you're thinking about this, you know, so I think that's a valid point. And I guess the way that I would deal with it is that if what is the time period? What is the normal time period between an event and a legend that emerges about that event? So legends don't appear immediately. Legends don't appear within a few years or a few decades of an event. Legends show up a long time afterwards. But the narrative about the resurrection of Christ, that came up early. If you study Gary Habermas's work, you will discover that the claim of the resurrection of Christ, that emerged within just a few years of his crucifixion. And so the claim that was made public and that was made broad and was disseminated throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. That claim existed very, very, very early, long before legends can actually finally take root. Legends take a long, long, long time to take root, and they appear later, and they appear after people have access to the original historical data. And the other thing that I want to talk about historical investigation is that okay, I just lost my train of thought. I'll get it back here in a second. Oh, when I had those long discussions with Dr. Blomberg, I learned, you wouldn't believe how much I learned from the guy. You know, I mean, I am having conversations with people about principles right now, many of which I learned from Dr. Blomberg. And one of the principles that I learned from him is the principle of the historical corrective. And the principle of the historical corrective is that if somebody disseminates a historical claim, and especially if they disseminate it very early, while the people who saw and heard all of this, the witnesses of these things, are still alive, if you disseminate a historical claim that's false, and there are people who are still alive who know it's false, then a historical corrective emerges. And so people will come out and they'll contradict it. They'll say, this is not true. It didn't happen this way. I was there. I know it didn't happen this way. I was there, and I've got a lot of friends who were there as well. And so if you want to call into question any of the elements of the historical narratives in the Gospels, or in the book of Acts, for that matter, the book of Acts was disseminated while a lot of those people were still alive. And so if you want to doubt any of those things, then if they were not true, you should find a historical corrective for them. And there isn't a historical corrective for any of this. And that partly explains why some of the historians that were contemporaries of the time didn't write about Jesus, because somebody had already done the work.
Okay.
And the people that did the work were Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Luke especially, because Luke was a first-rate historian. And so, you know, if there are times in my apologetics work where I might want to address a certain issue, but there might be another scholar that has addressed that issue already and can do a much better job of addressing it than I will. So instead of addressing the issue or writing about it myself, I'll just say, hey, so-and-so has expertise in this area. So I would be duplicating the effort if I were to do the same thing. And I think the reason why other historians didn't give us historical accounts that are mentioned in the Gospels is because the gospel writers already did the work. There's no reason for them to do the work. They already have the historical sources. They already have the historical narratives. They already have the eyewitness testimony. It's already written down. It's already being disseminated. So why should I duplicate the work that's already been done unless I know that it's false? And if the people who were still alive could have contradicted all of those narratives, they would have done that.
1 minute.
They didn't.
1 minute. Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure if there's any point I can make in 1 minute. Only thing I will say real quick, you know, the skeptic scholar Robert Price give us some examples of some legends that did develop early. Like not all legends need like many decades to develop. He gives in his book, there are some examples, some cases of legends that did appear early. I think Saveti or Sabata or so, I forgot how it's called, Sabata Sebi, something like that. There was some legends that appeared very early after the events, like some examples.
But the principle still stands. If a legend appears early, then the likelihood that if the legend is false, the likelihood that someone is going to come up and correct it is far higher than it is if the legend appears longer, in much later, So
All
yeah.
right. All right. So that's
That's
the
fair. Okay.
end of the informal dialogue portion there. So yeah, at this point, we're going to wrap up. We're going to give each of the guests 5-minute closings each, and then we're going to get to the audience questions, and we have quite a few. So a lot of good ones. So yeah, Phil, you started off, so let's give you the first 5-minute closing, and just let me know when you're ready, and I'll count you down.
I'm ready.
All right, 3, 2, 1, go ahead.
Okay. Well, so the purpose of a debate is to engage with the arguments that each debater presents. And as much as I admire Juan, and as much as I admire his work and his thinking, that he is a sharp guy. But as much as I admire him, I have to be honest and say that I don't think that Juan has engaged the arguments themselves that I presented. So if you want to establish your side of a debate question, you actually have to refute the arguments that your debating opponent has actually presented. And I don't think, and unless I missed it, I don't think that you actually refuted. I don't think that you actually engaged those arguments as logical syllogisms. And if you didn't engage them, then I don't think you've refuted them. So I could be wrong. I mean, this is one of the things that I constantly say in my podcasts. It's, Phil, people, I could be wrong. Phil's not infallible. So, but I don't think that one has actually refuted the arguments that I presented. And so I don't know that I could actually consider them refuted, and I think they should still stand. Now, the same rule applies to me, that I think I need to refute Juan's arguments, and I think I did offer a successful response to those arguments, and I stated that the contradictions that he brought up about the Gospels do not actually prove that the resurrection did not occur, because you can have contradictions in the Gospels and Jesus could still have risen from the dead, and the evidence could still be strong for it. And I think I engaged the idea that there are other contradictions in the Gospel. I think I showed that those are not actually contradictions. And then I think I successfully engaged the idea of probability, in that the fact that something is unlikely does not mean that it actually didn't happen. So I believe and I hope that I've engaged those arguments successfully, and I think that I've shown how they're faulty. But I could be wrong. I always want to leave the audience with the idea that Phil is not infallible. Phil is not always right. But this is not about who is right. It's about what's right. And I think that the fact that the apostles were so courageous and so confident in their message, I think it lends great weight to the idea that the message was true, because if it was false, they would not have had that kind of confidence. They knew that they would not have gotten away with it. And I don't see any historical evidence to support the claim that the apostles were actually insane. I think they exhibited the hallmarks of sanity and of rationality in all of their writings and all of their preaching. And the fact that they were willing to get back up and start preaching again after they were beaten to a pulp, that speaks to their courage. And I don't think there's any other explanation for that kind of courage than the fact that Jesus Christ actually did rise from the dead.
All right, cool. So now we go to Juan for his final 5-minute closing statement. So Juan, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, so 3, 2, 1, go for it.
So yeah, I think a lot of these resurrection debate. Which conclusion do you think is true? I think it's going to depend a lot on your priors and of your worldview, your entire worldview hypothesis regarding naturalistic events or miraculous event. How likely is that to happen? How likely is there to be a God, if there even a God? We didn't talk about this, right? So I'm not gonna, but it will, a lot of it depend. If someone believes there is no God, right, then it's like less likely, right? So a lot of this human or naturalistic background will be there. If you are a naturalist, you're going to think that the resurrection hypothesis is much more unlikely, right? So what I think, what usually happens in this debate is that the skeptic will try to offer something that is called a naturalistic hypothesis, right? To try to account how can we have these documents, how can we account for the Christian faith, how can we account for this data that we see in the Gospels, how can we explain that? And he's going to try to explain it in terms of natural events, like what natural event, what series of natural events could account for that. And in my particular case, I will say I would appeal to something like bereavement hallucinations combined with cognitive dissonance. And I will also say that there is some degree of embellishment and legendary development in the Gospels, in the documents. I think I will appeal to those things. And what will happen is at the end, you have like, I mean, the Christian may say, "Oh, this is a scenario that you're proposing is speculative. It's not based on evidence. It's unlikely, or it's improbable because of some reason." But the skeptic, I think the skeptic is always going to say, "Okay, but the idea of a man rising from the dead is even more improbable. So even if my scenario has some problems and it's improbable, your scenario is even more improbable." I think the skeptic can say that based on the naturalistic worldview that a resurrection is just too unlikely, right? We also discussed the issue of persecution and how the disciples were like willing to die and get persecuted over their belief. So I talked a little bit about Acts and how maybe I think there is skeptics don't grant the historicity of Acts. One will have to actually establish that. Like skeptics think that there has been some degree of embellishment and maybe there was some legendary development in Acts as well. So a part of this whole story about they being so courageous is based on the Bible itself, right? And there's also the issue about, okay, the disciples were not insane, but what I think is maybe we have to be careful not to see things in a very black and white thing, like, okay, this person is completely insane and acts completely crazy, right? Or is normal, right? So I think maybe there's some people with some mental issues that appear competent, well-spoken, normal. So yeah, maybe, I don't know. We'll have to take that into account. Yeah, I also brought up some contradictions, right? I don't think we didn't went into too much detail on it. We didn't have time. There is no time to go into all of that. That's fine. But I'm not convinced that like the harmonizations available, I'm not usually super convinced by them. I think sometimes this like they stretch language a little bit. I don't know. So they're like, yeah, sometimes feel like they propose some weird scenarios. They gin up some scenarios to harmonize the contradiction, but a natural reading of the text will lead you to a contradiction. So I think there will be an issue with the text. So yeah, I think that was a great debate overall. I thank you for Philip for taking the time for in doing this, also for Dale. And yeah, that was great. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Well, that does it for the debate proper. But now we have several audience questions, really good questions. But first, just for Michael Lofton, Jimmy J's Johnny Gibbers gifted a membership for Reason and Theology to Raphael. So Merry Christmas to him. Oh, you're muted there, Michael. But now
thank you so much, Jimmy. We appreciate you.
He can get access. You can now check out Michael's lectures. So, all right. So, in terms of the audience questions, oh, am I still here? All right. So the first question comes from Tornado, and he asks a question. So this is for both of you. You can both respond. Who actually saw Jesus resurrect? So I think they're asking about the event itself. Who was in the tomb and actually beheld the moment of the resurrection?
This is for me?
For both of you guys. So we'll start with Phil since
Yeah.
it's aimed at the Christian.
Yeah, I think it's for Phil.
Yeah, as far as we know, no one actually saw the actual resurrection event itself.
All right. And Juan, did you have anything to add?
Yeah. No, nobody saw that. They just saw him alive after that, right? Mary Magdalene saw him. All the disciples saw him, right? Paul also tells about James, I think. Cephas, yeah.
So the eyewitness part is to his resurrection appearances after the fact is what it means.
Okay. Now the soldiers who were guarding the tomb, they saw something because there's reports that there was an earthquake and so there's a narrative surrounding that, but I don't know that you could technically say that the Roman soldiers actually saw the resurrection phenomenon, because presumably it happened behind the stone. The stone was still sealing the tomb when he rose, and then the stone was rolled away afterwards. I think, if I remember my narratives correctly. So yeah, I would say essentially nobody actually saw the resurrection phenomenon. Like seeing an explosion or seeing a plane crash or something like that. They didn't. I don't think they did. So
fair enough. Okay. So this one comes from Lydiana Calves, and she says, "Is it more rational to reject an explanation solely because it involves a miracle?" So this is aimed first at you, Juan, or to accept it if it best explains the available evidence. So, Juan, we'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I would say in general, I think a miracle is so unlikely that it really should be your last resort. Like only if it's absolutely impossible, almost absolutely impossible to explain without a miracle. Okay, then maybe we can look at a miracle. But I think we should first exhaust the natural explanations.
All right. And Phil, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I would say no. It's not rational to reject a claim just because there's supernatural involved and just because it's unlikely. Because like I said before, all sorts of claims, all sorts of events occur that we could argue are extremely unlikely. And the fact that they're unlikely doesn't mean that they didn't actually happen. But I think I also addressed the idea that is it rational to reject a supernatural event in history just because it's supernatural? And my answer to that is no, it's not rational to do that either, because you're rejecting a supernatural, or you're rejecting a historical narrative on the basis of your own philosophical bias. And the philosophical bias is not a valid method of historical investigation.
Just sort of, do you mind if I just ask a quick follow-up to you, Phil?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just sort of curious. Do you think that it is ever appropriate? So let's say we take the religious context out of it, and I just come up to you randomly and say, guess what? I floated up to the moon today and came back, or something. Is it ever appropriate to dismiss or rational to reject an explanation solely because it involves a miracle or something like that?
I think I already answered that, but maybe I didn't. But it's not rational to reject something because it's a miracle. I think it's rational to reject it because the evidence points in the other direction, and to simply say that this is so unlikely because it involves a miracle, that's not evidence. That's simply a philosophical subjective bias, And I want to actually underscore what Juan said. He said you need to exhaust all other natural explanations first. And I think I accurately represented what you said there, Juan. And if I didn't, then correct me. But yeah, and I agree with that. I agree that you should exhaust natural explanations before you accept the supernatural explanation. But my argument is that we have exhausted the natural explanations, and so I don't remember who said this, but they said when all other alternatives have been eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's the principle that we would apply to the resurrection, that all of the other explanations have been eliminated because they are irrational. And I think that they are more unlikely than the resurrection. But Juan would disagree with me. He would say the resurrection is more unlikely than the other theories. So, and we could have a long conversation about that, but we don't have time.
Yeah, no worries. And that was Sherlock Holmes from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, his quote there. Yeah. So, okay, the next question, this one again is for you, Juan, starting with you, Juan. Kazali66 says, think of the Sabbath day night following the crucifixion. The apostles were at an all-time low. They cowered, they hid, and their leader was dead. It was game over for them. From that, Christianity rose. So his or her question is how?
Okay, yeah, how did that happen? Okay, I think somehow you could say that sadness or fear in that moment, I think it just wore off. I mean, kind of just, maybe it sounds funny, weird to you, but I think it was a shock, momentary shock, but it wore off at some point. They maybe Peter had a vision of Jesus or something like that, and that was the catalyst that got them to get courage or get a new strength or whatever to resume their preaching, because they were preaching before, to resume their preaching.
All right, Phil, did you want to comment on this? How on earth, given naturalism, did the Christian movement get started when they were at this very low state?
Yeah, I don't think you can explain it on naturalism. And when Juan says maybe they had a vision, maybe they had some kind of subjective experience that turned everything around for them. I've already addressed that issue, is that speculation about a possible explanation is not evidence. And not only that, but if you want to rely on the principle that something that is highly unlikely is not something that you should give credence to, then I would say you shouldn't give credence to the idea that they had a vision and that some subjective vision or dream suddenly catapulted them into this unbelievable, courageous crusade that where they claimed that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. And then if somebody says, if you doubt it, go ask the people who saw it. Go ask the people who were living at the time, because they're still alive. Paul said, hey, there's 500 people that were witnesses of the risen Jesus. If you doubt it, you can go ask them. And they had that kind of assurance. You don't get that kind of confidence, and you don't get that kind of argument when somebody just simply has a vision or a dream or something like that. So.
All right. So the next question comes from Mr. Jetty, and Phil, this one we're going to start with you on this. So he's asking about the analogy you gave about prior probabilities of meeting your wife, and so Mr. Jetty asks, I think Phil is confusing absolute likelihood with relative likelihood. The chance of you meeting your wife is exactly the same as the chance of anyone else meeting their wife, so the two have relativity. And I just wanted to add in, because there was another question from someone else talking about Bayes' theorem and how it is necessary to account for the prior probabilities and stuff like that. So what's your take on that question, Phil?
Well, I think that I don't know about this term absolute improbability versus relative improbability. I'm not sure I understand that distinction, but I think my fundamental argument is that meeting my wife is just as improbable as Jesus rising from the dead, because even though meeting my wife did not involve a supernatural event, it still involved improbability. And if you want to address the supernatural, that's being addressed from a philosophical basis. It's not being addressed from an evidential basis. So I guess that's mainly the way that I would address that.
Okay. And Juan, what did you want to say on that?
Yeah, I think probabilities can be a complex issue. But I think, let me try to put it this way. Let's say we take Jesus' resurrection, and we say that on top of Jesus, the improbability of a man rising from the dead, we add the same. What are the probabilities that it's going to be Jesus at that particular day, at that particular time, at that particular tomb? And we see, the probabilities are even lower because he has to be in the particular tomb, right? I think there will be something about that is like missing the point there, because it doesn't have to be in this particular tomb. In the same way, it doesn't have to be your wife, right? So on top of all the particulars that are involved in the probabilities, you add the one about a dead man rising from the dead, which will be add to all these specifics, right? So yeah, I think I agree with this, what he's saying there.
All right. So this one is a two-part question from Jimmy J's Johnny Gibbers. Love that name. So his first question is, would you, so I think this is aimed at you, Juan. Would you dismiss multiple historical witnesses in any other case just because the conclusion is unlikely? And his follow-up question, the second part, what amount of historical evidence would actually be sufficient to change your mind, if any?
Right. So, I think will I dismiss witnesses? I think depends on how unlikely it is. But if it's very, very, very unlikely, then actually, yes, I will dismiss it, because I think witnesses, I don't think they are reliable. I think witness testimony can be very unreliable sometimes. People could get mistaken or lie or whatever. And the other question, right, is a good question. So what evidence will change my mind? And here I will have to be, if I have to be honest, I will admit it will be very difficult. Like, I will put it like this: even if we had a ton of evidence of Jesus rising from the dead, like, or more people, Jesus appearing to the Roman Senate. We had the Roman Senate telling us about Jesus. We had the Jewish council, the entire Jewish council, telling us we saw Jesus. We have a ton of historians telling us we saw Jesus rising from the dead. If we had much more, I will still think to myself, okay, maybe Jesus was some kind of Houdini, or super strange, super weird. He managed to pull off some crazy scam somehow. That's what I would tell myself, honestly, if we had like even more evidence. So I don't think historical evidence could change my mind. You have to show it to me personally, or show me a video camera recording the whole thing, something like that.
All right, AI, get to work. Yeah, just a quick follow-up before I go to Phil. So Juan, are you saying that nothing short of absolute proof, 100% proof, is your standard? Would you put it in those terms before you?
I mean historical.
Yeah.
We're talking about eyewitness testimony. No, I don't know. I guess. Ancient. Let me give you an example of what I will accept if I wake up tomorrow and everybody around me is talking about how they saw an alien in the sky or something like that. Like, everybody I know, okay, I will believe them. I think I will believe them, because it boils down to either there was an alien in the sky, or everybody is part of a conspiracy that is trying to fool me. And this option now becomes dumb, right? They are at that point, I actually believe that it was the alien. So, but if you are talking about ancient testimony, like something that is 2,000 years ago, we cannot verify. I don't think there is any amount of ancient testimony that can change my mind, because ancient testimony is just too unreliable. So yeah, I don't.
Okay. All right. So Phil, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, and then we'll go to our last question.
Yeah. Well, two things. If historical, or if human testimony is unreliable, then it's incoherent to say that I would rely on all my friends' testimony when you don't consider human testimony reliable. You know, I mean, so there seems to be a double standard there, and there could be people who would doubt whether or not somebody saw an alien in the sky, and if they were there and they were looking at the sky and they took pictures of the sky and they said, hey, no alien appeared in the sky, I'm looking at the same place that all these other people are, then that would be counter evidence against it. And so I don't know that it's actually a real world scenario that everybody that you know has, saw an alien in the sky, and you don't know anybody who saw the same sky and didn't see an alien, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily a realistic framing. But I always go back to my original principle, and that is that historical facts are not established by probability. Historical facts are historical events and facts are established by evidence, and probability and likelihood, they don't count as evidence, because like I said before, you could prove to me that the resurrection of Jesus is unbelievably improbable. It could be the most improbable claim in human history, and I would agree. I think it is the most improbable claim in human history. But historical facts are not established by probability. They're established by evidence. And if the evidence is coherent, if the evidence is reliable, and if the evidence takes the same form that it takes today, that we establish historical facts and we establish verdicts in a courtroom. So think of a courtroom, think of our justice system. We establish the truth of an accusation based on testimony. And so nobody gets up in a courtroom and says, it is so unlikely that Rob Reiner's son murdered his parents. That is just, that's so unlikely. It's unbelievably unlikely. Nobody gets up in this courtroom and says that. What they rely on is evidence, and evidence is a matter of testimony. It always has been, and it always will.
All right, and I see the great Juan, he doesn't have a chance, but he just sort of follows up. Juan, for you, is it really human testimony that's the issue for you, or is it more an issue of being able to trust that specific testimony because you don't know them?
Yeah, no, I think if I do know them, like for example, if my mom tells me something, I think I'm gonna trust her more than if a stranger tells me something, obviously, because something tells me like, my mom wouldn't lie to me like that, right? But I think in general, it's just like, yeah, human testimony is not enough to establish something as extraordinary as a resurrection, right? That's what I will say.
All right, fair enough. So here's the last question from, again, Tornado 2. And Phil, this is aimed at you to start. So Tornado saying, doesn't Matthew 27, verse 19, so this is Claudia relaying her dream to Pilate, suggest that Pilate may have made sure that nothing bad happened to Jesus? Sorry.
Can you ask that question again? I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think they're kind of maybe providing a denial of the crucifixion, maybe, and they're saying, look, the Bible tells us Claudia had this supernatural dream and warned Pilate not to punish Jesus. So therefore, Pilate made sure nothing bad happened to Jesus.
So is the premise there that the crucifixion didn't actually occur?
I think so. Tornado, if you want to just clarify in the chat.
Which verse? Matthew 27, 19. Okay, I'm going to check it. What does it say?
Yeah, it's basically Claudia saying, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today.
In a dream because of him, yeah. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Would it give Pilate the motive to try to avoid crucifying Jesus? Maybe. If that's the question, I would say, I think Pilate was very conflicted about the whole thing. He wanted to wash his hands of it. And I don't know how superstitious he was. I don't know how seriously he took his wife whenever she said something like that to him. I just don't know. I think there's so many variables that I'm not sure that we could really draw any reasonable conclusions from that. That's just my assessment of it. So Juan, you can tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think so. So the wife just had some kind of dream or premonition. She told it to Pilate, but he was like, "No, I'm not going to change all procedure or all the criminal procedures over a dream you had, right?" And he will say like, "Doesn't matter, right? What the priest said will have more weight than a dream of his wife, right?"
Kind of reminds me of the idea that we're not going to go out and start preaching the resurrection just because of a dream we had. Sorry, that was a jab there, Juan. And I didn't mean it to be mean or anything.
Fair enough. So yeah, that's I think at this point we've covered all the questions that I can see. So I'll bring Michael in to close us out. But yeah, thank you to both of you guys for doing the debate. You're muted, Michael.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you both of you, gentlemen, Juan and Phil, for coming on and doing this. This was absolutely excellent, and would love to have you guys back on in the future if y'all would like to do another one at some point. Thank y'all so much for your participation there in the chat. I appreciate all of you, and thank you so much, Jimmy, for gifting that membership. Make sure to hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless you all.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Yep.